And so yes, as Jane said, this is moving slightly beyond the birth space to what comes next. So about 10% of babies born in the UK are born preterm, so quite a number of them will end up in the neonatal space. And I wanted to pick out some elements that always speak to me about that early experience of parenting and becoming a family in a space that's very public and very unanticipated, and some of the design elements in neonatal units that influence that experience for parents, which may obviously have some parallels with the birthing spaces as well. So we start off with our typical John Lewis nursery, and I think this sort of slide to me is around what's the parent anticipating. What's the place of birth? Is it going to be a home birth? Is it going to be a birthing centre? Is it going to be in a hospital? But also, where are they planning to bring their baby home to if they're birthing outside of the home as well? So there will be, throughout pregnancy, there will be this anticipation of what this event is going to be like, including the environment in which it occurs. And then you have a baby who's admitted to a neonatal unit, and you have a very different experience. Very different physical environment, very different sensory environment, and very different social emotional environment. And so I think, I just find this slide traumatic to look at because there's so much going on, let alone the personal experience of parents who are then having to have their early parenting experience in this environment as well. And so I think one of the things that I think about for parents who've gone through a very different start to their parenting journey is what happens during that birth experience or that lead up to that birth experience. So that preparation during pregnancy about becoming a parent is often disrupted, obviously, particularly if they have a preterm birth. And there's also this notion of anticipatory grief as well. So particularly for women who are experiencing a high-risk pregnancy, they will grieve the fact that they don't necessarily get to have the pregnancy or the antenatal care or the experiences that they had hoped. And I think for many women, they talk around the loss of key markers as well, and we'll come on to that. So things that they thought would be part and parcel of their pregnancy experience. But in terms of the public elements, they then become a parent or are forced to be a parent in a setting that will inevitably place significant constraints on how they can be with and interact with their baby. And that previous slide gives you some very real examples of what that can look like. So it's a profoundly different start to parenting to what many families anticipate during pregnancy. And so you look at what parents try to do in terms of feeling close and connected to your baby. So, I'll talk a little bit later about early physical contact post-delivery. But for most parents, their first hold of their baby might not be for several days, sometimes longer, depending on the fragility of their baby, the staff availability. And so they seek other ways to be physically close and connected. This picture down here, you can just see a parent's hand that the baby's holding onto as well. But finding some way amidst all of this other technology to find some level of physical connection with their baby. But also some of the traditional parenting experiences that they anticipated, so being able to hold their baby or bathe their baby or feed their baby has to happen in very different ways. Or see this mum here who's breastfeeding on the unit in very public spaces as well. So there's this constant reinforcement that your early start to parenting and your early relationship with your baby is not what you potentially anticipated it was going to be like. And it happens in an environment that has many constraints. So I just wanted to share a few slides from a couple of different studies I've done looking at early experiences of parents in the NICU, and to think specifically about the environmental elements of that. So one of the things that parents will often describe in their early days of their admission to the neonatal unit is needing to relinquish this anticipated or imagined role of the parent that they were going to be. And there's a lot of grief that can be involved in that as well. So, parents will talk about, not being able to go to antenatal or missing half of their antenatal classes, or, not being able to have their baby shower, not being able to sort of leave work for maternity leave. Often sometimes not even being congratulated on the birth of their baby because people aren't sure what to say if the baby's very fragile and they're worried about survival. The loss of not being able to have that baby skin to skin immediately after birth will leave a lot of parents worried that they will then struggle to bond with their baby as well. And they have to sort of, come into an environment where they are not central. We talk a lot about family-centred and family-integrated care in the neonatal space. We don't do it particularly well. It's often very tokenistic. And parents will often feel, unless they're, a parent has other resources and is able to advocate for themselves and their aspirations in that place, can be very hierarchically just left sitting and watching what's going on. So this issue about control in that space is very relevant in the neonatal space as well. And so what happens over time then is coming to revision, well, what type of parent can I be in this space? I might not be able to hold my baby when I want to, and I might not be able to put my baby to the breast. But what can I do where I start to reclaim what it's like to be a parent to this baby, which is different from that anticipated one? And it all sort of leads into this element of trying to develop a locus of control, which has been a lot of what we've talked about in terms of the birthing space. But some of the ways parents will do that is they'll seek lots of opportunities for parenting. And I think the thing that is really important for me is that it's about what's meaningful to the parent. So often there's this view that it's like, oh, would you like to change the nappy? Or, would you like to hold the gavage feed? And it's like, well, if that actually isn't meaningful to the parent, that just feels quite tokenistic around, come on mum, you can just do this, that'll make you feel better. And actually, do we ever have that conversation around what would make you feel like a parent? What would you like to be able to achieve with your baby today? Lots of Googling goes on. Information is power. And we feed into that from a neonatal staff point of view as well, because we go on rounds and we talk about all these things, and a parent will then be like Googling it all because it's not explained to them necessarily in ways that's accessible. And they feel like they know that power is control, so they're constantly trying to sort of catch up and almost become a quasi-professional in the neonatal space, because that's the only way they can regain a sense of power. And as we saw in those earlier pictures, the physical, being able to be physically close and connected to the baby is key, and breastfeeding is obviously a very key part of that. And we are getting better at supporting breastfeeding in the neonatal space, but we are still not in any way, shape or form brilliant at it, I should say. And then some of the stuff that comes out in my work, which is specifically about environmental boundaries, and again what we've talked about in the birthing spaces is environment beyond the physicality elements, so the social and cultural environments. And I think from a parent point of view, we were talking in the little breakout group about how different environmental contexts will have different responses for people. In the neonatal space, we're sort of used to that technological environment. We sort of become a little bit immune to it. And so I think it's quite easy to forget a parent's emotional response, acute stress response, dissociation responses that parents can have to walking into that space. And it's quite common, you'll find that parents, from a self-protection point of view, sometimes step back from that and then they're immediately labelled in terms of they're never visiting. And even that, I think, is an interesting phrase, because you'll be surprised at how many people still talk about parent visitation as opposed to supporting parent presence. It's still this notion that you're here to visit your baby. Obviously the environment in the NICU is designed to support the care of the baby, and there's been a lot of work on NICU environmental design and the sensory environment, so that's why in some of the neonatal unit space it's very dark, or the incubators are covered. We try to be quiet. We're not that very good, we're not brilliant at it, because that's about the developing baby. But what we haven't been as good at is around the physical attributes of the environment to support family relationships as well. So I'm sure Jane will share her experience at the time, but we have a 47-cot unit at the Royal London, and the parent room, if it's full, probably seats about 10 parents. If you're lucky, and that's like if you're all happy to sit quite close to one another. So there hasn't been the same thought put into what does the family space need to look like, not just the space for all of the equipment. I think the biggest thing for me environmentally is separation from the baby, and we have very few units in the UK where parents can stay with their baby 24/7, which is really odd because in paediatric wards that's a given, but from a neonatal unit it's not. that's partly space, it's partly, you know, capital estates, but there's one unit down in Exeter which just has pull-out cots, you know, open bay NICU, pull-out cots next to, and, you know, parents are welcome to stay. So it's very much a cultural thing as well. But parents will obviously at some point have to go home and rest. So there's physical separation from their baby, but, you know, often parents will talk to me about feeling emotionally separate from their baby, even when they're sitting at the incubator side, because that physical barrier of the incubator is an emotional separation for them. And we know from infant work that maternal separation for neonates is the biggest trauma of their neonatal experience. And then there's some of the cultural influences of the NICU in terms of how things are done around here. So again, very similar to what we've talked about in the delivery and labour space. So, you know, who gets the chair? There might not be two comfortable chairs in a SCBU. Who manages to get in and get the comfortable chair? You know, why is it that you actually have to go and leave your baby's bedside to go to the expressing room to express milk? You know, why is it not designed so that you can actually express milk at your baby's bedside? So there's lots of things that are unwritten rules, if you like, about how we should operate in that space as a parent, which obviously can get in the way of parents' wishes to the way they wish to be engaged with their baby's care. And then the practical elements as well, which are particularly around geographical and financial, and that's just about the way neonatal care is organised. In England, so we have fewer tertiary centres, which means if your baby's very sick, your baby might be admitted to a unit that's quite geographically distant from where you live. I just wanted to then talk about how some of the things are changing from a design point of view. So in the US now, because, you know, slightly more money in terms of hospital design, slightly more space in terms of capital footprints, a lot of units now are going to single family room design. So you see one here that's traditional, but you can see in the second photo the ability then for a parent to be able to personalise that space, which when you're in a 10-bay open bay NICU is a little harder to achieve. And there are a lot of positive elements for parents and babies being nursed in this sort of environment, but one of the downsides that parents will talk about is they then lose the peer support because they're in a room with the door closed, so they don't get that natural, unless they're going to the expressing room, though in this situation they don't have to because there's pumped, wired-in pumps in the room, but unless they're sort of going to the fridge. But the couches pull out so parents can stay 24/7. And then to sort of finish off, just to bring it back to the birth space then, is that some neonatal teams are now working with their obstetric colleagues to support. I'm not aware yet of a unit in this country that will do skin to skin after birth. That's slightly still a step too far, but they will stabilise the baby, wrap the baby, and then allow the parent to physically hold the baby. Sometimes it's only for a few minutes, but to allow that physical connection before the baby is transferred to the neonatal unit, as opposed to the transport incubator being wheeled past where all you get to do is see the baby or maybe reach out a finger and touch. And this is from a group at Imperial that I did some work with, so they offer delivery room cuddles, if at all possible, for all of their preterms, so they stabilise the baby and then hand them to the parents. And you can see from this woman's quote was, to me it's around recapturing that normality, so accepting and acknowledging that this birth experience is not what they anticipated, that it was, you know, not what they had hoped for, but by just being able to hold and take photos of these first moments of them as a family, with some level about reclaiming the birth experience they'd hoped to achieve.